Hey there, welcome to another Captain Cosplay tutorial. Today I'll be making the Elite Knight helmet from the Dark Souls video game series. I made this helmet for the stunt team that I'm currently a part of, which is where that footage at the beginning came from. If you want to see more stuff like that, let me know in the comments. I might be able to get you some content out of that. The first thing I did was create a pattern. For the base of the helmet, I did what I always do. Spray adhesive on a mannequin head, plastic bag, duct tape. This helmet has a lot of visible seams, which is always nice, because then you don't have to worry about masking seams on your version. I marked the different sections and added registration marks before I cut them out, so I can line the pieces up the same way later. For the lower half of the faceplate, I held cardstock up to the mannequin head and pinned it in place so I could roughly outline the shape of the cheek section. Then I took the cardstock off of the head, cleaned up the lines, and cut out the general shape. From there, I adjusted the shape of the outline in certain areas and added the detail markings, like the raised strips, on the edges. I made a quick adjustment to the faceplate as I had originally cut the front edge as a straight line, but then realized that it actually had an inward curve. Once that was fixed, I moved on to patterning the forehead part of the faceplate. While the cheek was still on the mannequin head, I slid a piece of cardstock under it so I could trace the edge for where the forehead would end. Then I wrapped it around the mannequin head to find the middle seam line and figure out how high and low I should take that line. I also cut out a copy of the general shape of the forehead since I wasn't sure if I could get the curves on the top edge of the forehead right on the first go. The next thing I did was mark out the rectangular holes in the lower half of the faceplate. This process is pretty tedious, especially if you want to make sure it matches the reference material. It's fairly self-explanatory, but I also needed to keep talking so you could see a bit more of the footage without awkward silence. Once I had the holes marked, I moved to the two curves on the top edge of the forehead, as well as the detail pieces along that same edge. I found it pretty challenging to get these curves right, but I think they turned out okay. Once I had the faceplate the way I liked it, I transferred all the duct tape patterns to cardstock so that they were completely flat and easier to work with. I did this by spraying spray adhesive onto the cardstock and sticking the duct tape patterns on. Then I traced the edges and cut out the whole piece as well as the registration marks. Also, quick note, this pattern is currently available on my Etsy store. You can buy one for yourself if you'd like to make a helmet of your own. I'll have a link to my store in the description. Once all of the pattern pieces were transferred, I traced them onto 5mm craft foam. As I was doing this, I was reminded that I need to get a new silver Sharpie, as the one I have no longer works. Black ink on black foam is a bit harder to see, especially when I'm trying to make exact cuts in a room with subpar lighting. Once all my foam pieces were cut out, I started gluing them together. I'm using barge contact cement, which is highly toxic and releases a lot of fumes, so make sure you're working in a very well-ventilated space. I started with the two center pieces and then worked my way out from the middle until the whole base was assembled. I also had bad lighting for the beginning of that shot because I forgot to turn on one of the other lights in my room. I liked the flat look of each section between the seams, so I gave the helmet a light pass with my heat gun, just to seal the foam without softening it too much. Next was the faceplate. I traced the pieces onto foam and cut them out. For the center line on all the pieces, I cut at an inward 45-degree angle. This way, the pieces will meet at an angle when they're glued, and create that central hard edge that this helmet has. I was running out of foam while I was working on this project, which is why I ended up working in two colors. At least it allowed me to see my lines better for some of the pieces. Because I was running low on foam though, I wasn't able to fit the second forehead piece onto my sheet of foam, and I didn't have another sheet to use. I ended up shifting my patterns around so that part of the top corner fell off of the edge of the sheet. I cut the missing piece out of a different part of the sheet and glued it on. I chose this piece in particular because I was able to hide the seam later by covering it with the detail pieces that I already knew would be there. Next, I heat formed the pieces for the faceplate. For the forehead, I rounded the pieces out with a wiffle ball. The cheek pieces had a more complex shape to them, which was both a horizontal curve around the face as well as a vertical curve at the middle seam. Then I glued all of the base faceplate pieces together, starting with the center seams, and then gluing the top and bottom halves together. Next, I made the detail pieces for the helmet seams. I used 3mm craft foam cut in strips that were approximately 1/4 of an inch wide. I glued them onto the helmet with super glue, and then used my rotary tool to round the edges along the length of the entire strip. You could also sand the edges before gluing the strips down, which would mean you're less likely to damage the base of the helmet, but I decided to glue them down first because I felt like I had more control over the strip itself that way. Oh yeah, this part's fun. I might need to make a whole separate video talking about this because this is complicated. Here I'm trying to make the triangular center fin. I made a 45-degree angle cut through a 1/2-inch floor mat and screwed up my first attempt. I went back to the other side from the original angled cut and tried to make another angled cut with the flat side of the foam facing down. This cut ended up being a bit steeper than 45 degrees, which created an isosceles triangle with the original flat side of the foam as one of the long sides. I know it's complicated, so if you want me to go more in depth in a separate short video, let me know in the comments. Now I'm moving on to the trim on the faceplate. The trim on the top edge of the cheek pieces is a little bit wider than the trim on the rest of the cheek. I cut 2 strips of 2mm foam that were about 5/8 of an inch wide, and for the last inch at the end tapered down to 1/4 of an inch. I angled the center ends of the 2 pieces and glued them together before gluing them to the faceplate. Then I cut longer strips that were 1/4 of an inch wide. I did the same thing, gluing them together at the center first, then gluing them to the faceplate. Since the foam is so thin, I was able to cut straight strips and then stretch and curve them while I was gluing. Next, I made a pattern from the detail sketch on the top edge of the forehead and used that to cut out a double-layered stair-stepped detail piece out of 2 pieces of 2mm foam. Then I glued it to the faceplate with barge cement. Once that was on, I cut out an 1/8-inch wide strip of 2mm craft foam that went around the edge of the eye slit. After I had the faceplate fully assembled, I used my rotary tool to sand down the bottom edges of the forehead piece where it had been glued to the lower face. I wanted to make sure it fit as smoothly as possible against the base of the helmet, otherwise it would throw off the fit of the whole thing. After a lot of careful marking and placing, I glued the faceplate onto the base helmet, only to use barge cement thinner to take it right back off. The way I had lined up the 2 pieces left too much empty room in parts of the helmet, so I ended up tilting the faceplate up and cutting off part of the bottom of the base helmet. If you're using my pattern from Etsy, don't worry, these adjustments have already been made for you. Next, there are 2 small cones that go on what I can best describe as the ears of the helmet. For these pieces, I used a sharpened piece of copper pipe with a 3/4 inch diameter to cut out 2 circles of 10mm Cosplay foam. A 1/2-inch floor mat would also work. Once I had the circles cut out, I marked the center on one side and used my rotary tool to sand the circles into cones. Then I glued the cones onto the ears of the helmet in the small curve created by the trim on the lower faceplate. And now, the last step before painting, battle damage. The main reference image I was using showed a couple of 3-dimensional markings like cuts, scrapes, and dents. I used my wood burner and my rotary tool to create these details and added a few of my own in places that weren't visible in the reference or that I thought looked empty. Before I started painting, I sealed the foam with a few coats of Plastidip. The color that I used for this helmet was gunmetal gray. I used this color so that I wouldn't have to use as much actual paint in order to get the final color I wanted. Since this helmet is for my stunt team, I wanted to use mainly Plastidip and use as little regular paint as possible. Once the Plastidip had dried, I began to very lightly dust the helmet with silver spray paint. I wanted the helmet to have a metallic look, but I didn't want it to be true silver, and I liked the darkness of the gunmetal gray Plastidip. This project, in addition to the sci-fi Link armor that I made earlier this year, have made me realize that I need to save up for an airbrush. I could have easily bought or mixed the dark metallic gray color that I was looking for, instead of having to try and mix and layer different kinds of spray paint. Once the silver paint was dry, I used a rag to rub it into the helmet so that it covered the surface evenly and didn't remain dusty and rub off onto anything that the helmet touched. I wanted this helmet to look dirty and used, so I mixed up a wash with black and brown paint and water. My first few washes ended up way too thin, so I still need to work on getting that mixture figured out. After I drained some water and added more paint, I got a consistency that worked. I applied it to the whole helmet and wiped it off with a rag. This left some of the paint in the cracks and crevices of the helmet, which makes it look dirty. The last bit of paint and weathering for this helmet is rust. My main reference image had a little bit of rust on the helmet, and I liked the way it looked. I'd never really done rust on a prop before either, so I wanted to give it a shot. I mixed brown and orange acrylic paint and applied it using a technique I would describe as a mixture of dry brushing and stippling. I got the paint on my brush and wiped most of it off, then loosely stippled and dragged the brush to spread the paint thinly in the areas where I wanted the rust to be. I tried to put rust in the areas where I thought water was most likely to gather on the helmet, which was mostly corners and seam lines. Finally, the last thing I did was add some padding. The helmet is just a little loose on my head, and since I'm going to be using this for stunts, I wanted to make sure it was snug. I added a 1/2-inch thick piece of open cell foam, or upholstery foam, to the forehead. The piece I cut out was approximately 1 inch wide and 4 to 5 inches long, or from the second seam line on one side to the other. Alright, the helmet is now finished, and I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. I think I might have over-rusted a little. That was just because I'm used to having my reference pictures on my phone, and my phone is also how I record, so I didn't print out anything next to me to look at for reference while I was working on this. And as much as I have solidified my decision to get an airbrush to make personalizing my paint colors easier, I am fairly happy with how the metal color turned out on this one. Since the paint is mostly Plasti-Dip, it's still nice and flexible. I'm not really worried about it getting damaged, which is good since it's a stunt helmet. Also, since it's a stunt helmet, if we're going to be using these multiple times over and over, I am considering going in and cutting out that little center piece of the eye slit, just because it does restrict the field of view just a little bit. This is a much better view than this is. It's not horrible, it's not a big difference, but it's something I'm considering. Also, I've got that foam pad in there, so it's not moving around, it's staying in place. I've got a consistent view the whole time I'm wearing it. So, all in all, I am happy with how this turned out. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you can follow along and make your own one of these, or use it as reference for something that you are planning on making. If you enjoyed it, consider liking the video. Subscribe if you want to see more tutorials like this. I've got plenty of other armor and helmet tutorials and plenty more on the way. I've also decided on my Halloween costume for this year, and I'm going to be announcing that soon, so stick around if you want to find out what I'm going to be doing for Halloween and what that next big project is going to be. I've also got multiple social media accounts where I will post work in progress pictures and behind the scenes updates kind of things. I had multiple pictures uploaded to Instagram while I was working on this thing, and Instagram is the main place where I'm active. So check those out if you want to see stuff like that as well. So other than that, I think we're done. I think this turned out nicely. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.